welcome into this week's book club episode for Star Wars Catalyst. We are taking the novel Catalyst by James Luceno, a couple of chapters at a time, and really digging into the themes and happenings of the book. If you want to go ahead and check out our playlist of the book so far, I hope you get caught up, but really all you've missed is Chapter 1, because today we're going to discuss Chapters 2 and 3. So Chapter 2 is titled Isolation. This is all still during Life During Wartime in Part 1. And isolation is very much the theme of the chapter. We see Galen, and Galen has been separated from Lyra. He has been held in a cell of some kind, and he's being questioned by an official from the planet he's on that now works for the Separatists. It's been about 2 weeks, and the planet is under new leadership, has a new constitution, and Galen is trying to navigate that when really he realizes he's being held hostage. Basically, they want him to admit to being a spy for the Republic, and once he does that, then he can join the Separatists and continue his research just for the Seps. Their conversation, I thought, was really interesting. She has a lot of ideas about what goes on in the Republic, asking if the child Lyra is carrying is his, or is she just merely a surrogate for women on Coruscant, saying that's clearly what women on Coruscant do. She has a lot of preconceived notions about him, like the conditions he might live in, how rich he must be, and so Galen's trying to navigate what she thinks of him, and what's kind of causing her to feel a certain way about him. Now, whether or not this is just to kind of get under his skin, or is what's genuinely believed, I don't really know, although I'm guessing these are genuine questions. Galen is also being asked about the Clone Army, where the Clone Army came from, of the Jedi, which is probably more of the stuff that's just the charges that they're trying to file against him, but still kind of showing how they're really coming after him for being this spy character. Now, the isolation here for Galen is obvious. He's away from his wife, he's away from his friends, he has one point of contact besides his interrogator, and he's mostly on his own. But there is a larger discussion about isolation and what we're hearing from Gupe, I think is how you would say the character's name, but basically talking about why their planet is joining the Separatists, that they were a Republic world for a long time, and that they were isolated, that the Republic was not taking care of them in the way they ought to. Like so many of the Separatists have an amazing point. The people of the Separatists really weren't wrong. It was the leadership of the Separatists that was bad, in that the Republic really did stop caring about so many of the Outer Rim worlds, and that there were a lot of bad things going on that the Republic was not getting involved in, and leaving a lot of the not as rich worlds or not as important worlds kind of out to dry. This planet, Vault, and the people there, the government now, are not wrong about that, but where they're wrong is that the Separatists are going to help them, because at the end of the day, even if what the Separatists say is a great thing, they're still being led by Count Dooku and the Trade Federation and the Commerce Guild and the Techno Union and all of these corporations, basically, and they're not going to care about them any more than the Republic did. And I've always found that really interesting and compelling about anything that's discussed during the Clone War, is that if you talk to just the ground level people of the Separatist movement, you could almost get behind them, because all they want is resources for their planet. You kind of, if you're familiar with Star Wars The Clone Wars, I think it's season 1, and I'm blanking on the name, but it's of the episode, but it's where Padme goes to Rhodia and meets the character she calls Uncle Anno, who's just like a friend of the family. He's head of the planet of Rhodia, and it's the one where everyone thinks Jar Jar is a Jedi, that whole thing. The whole point of that episode is that this character that's close to Padme joins the Separatists because the Republic isn't helping, but then the Separatists betray him. And like that one episode encapsulates so much of what's going on in wartime during the period of the Clone Wars, that the Separatists don't actually have a bad point. They have really bad leadership, and it's really that there's corruption in the Republic and there's corruption in the Separatists, and it's just like two corrupt organizations fighting over the galaxy, with the people of the galaxy having to pick which one is going to screw them over less effectively. That's really what I find so compelling about the Clone Wars era, versus something like the Galactic Civil War we see in the original trilogy, where it's obvious the Empire is bad, and you have the Band of Rebellion people and what they're doing, and how it's, even if there's questionable people on the side, that the sides themselves aren't questionable. And you even get that with the sequel trilogy, with the Resistance versus the First Order. But the Clone Wars is a kind of a unique period, at least in current canon, maybe less so in Legends, but in current canon, because you basically don't have a good side. You have good people, you have one side that believes in good ideals, but really the other side is just calling out the original side for not following those good ideals. And it gets so complicated because both sides have a point, they just also have bad leadership. And we're seeing that as an example here, that so much of what's going on with Galen is him being caught up in what's happening to so many Outer Rim worlds, where they feel like their only option is the separatist movement, and how that benefits Count Dooku and General Grievous and the other characters that we know, and ultimately how that benefits Palpatine, because everything in Star Wars kind of comes back to Palpatine, or at least more and more these days. The second half of Chapter 2 is from Lyra's perspective. So again, we're seeing this isolation. She's on her own, but she's getting a little break from that isolation. She gets a letter from Galen. Now, this letter from Galen further explains their relationship. Galen is writing this really lovely, very beautiful letter to her that's very emotional, and not something you would necessarily expect from a scientist, but he seems to be a very amazing writer. But amongst the writing, he also has like math equations, and he's literally like, I put these math equations in case you thought they would be funny, lol. Like, it was just, his character is so amusing in that regard. And it's great that Lyra actually really loves this, because I could see him being really eccentric and annoying to somebody else. Like, I don't know if I could handle a man like Galen, but I love that Lyra can handle a man like Galen, if that makes sense. But I also really like that as Galen is saying, like, hey, I've figured out where you are, and he's like, you know, I like to think that I'm looking for your window, he completely leaves out telling her where he is. So again, he's like, he's so bright, and he is clearly loves Lyra and is considerate of her because of his words, but then he also just like completely blanks and doesn't think that she would want to look for him. And so it's always this like, he's so smart until he's not. And like, that's the constant thing with him as a character. The other important thing here is he tells her the conundrum, that he can fess up to something he didn't do in being a Republic spy, and then they wouldn't be in prison anymore, but it would be letting go of the principles that they believe in. And Lyra talks about how he's genuinely asking her, like, this isn't I'm asking you and then you can't be mad about it later kind of a thing. And it's not like he's just asking her to make her feel better, but he's still going to do whatever he's going to do. He's genuinely like, I am yielding this decision to you out of respect to you, because what's most important is you and our child. And it's this really good moment with him, and again, just kind of showing that kind of level of good person he is, even if he's also kind of aloof, and kind of does, selfish isn't really the right word, but he does a lot of things, or doesn't do a lot of things, out of aloofness that can come off as not caring for someone else, when really it's just him being kind of dense in his intelligence. And then the end of the chapter is actually them not being alone and not being in isolation after all, because their droid from the first chapter gets like reactivated and is able to send out a signal to Zurpin asking for help. So that's kind of where we're left off in the second chapter. Third chapter, Secret Weapons. This is my boy Orson Krennic. So if you don't know, Orson Krennic is one of my favorite Star Wars characters ever, favorite villain characters ever, certainly one of my favorite villain characters that stays a villain throughout the entirety of the character as we know him. I love Orson. I love him so much. He's one of the few Funkos I have. I know it looks like I have several Funkos, but this is like the sum total of my Funko collection, and I'm a big fan of Orson Krennic and his fabulous, fabulous cape. So getting Orson Krennic, who's got a brown hair and blue eyes and is conveniently about my age in this novel, is nice. Although unfortunately Luceno spends significantly less time describing him than he spent describing Galen. And I took very clear note of that. So in this chapter, Secret Weapons, we learn about the secret weapon. The Republic is building the Death Star, which is something of a revelation. Even if you see the end of Revenge of the Sith and you see that Death Star there, it was always kind of fuzzy, like, was that weird time jump forward. What was that? For a while, canonically, it was just called the Death Star prototype, which it still might be called. But the idea is that the original construction of the Death Star actually started during the prequel trilogy, kind of early, even into the Clone War, and they got the plans, and they don't really know all where the plans came from. That they kind of like took them from the Separatists, and do they trust this, and where are they going to get the labor from? And of course we know that it's a Geonosian design. But what I find really interesting about this construction of the Death Star is they're trying to build it, but they don't even know what the weapon is. Like, they're literally like, here's these plans we found somewhere. Let's build this, even though we don't know what it does. We'll figure out what it does as we're building it. And so you have the construction of the Death Star, and then you have the construction of the weapon. And that's something we see in this novel, and I think we see in the Tarkin novel, also by Lucino, as well. I mean, it's discussed in Rogue One, the idea of, the weapons online, the weapons ready. And I think that kind of helps explain why it took the Death Star so long to build, even though we see it in Revenge of the Sith, is that they kind of started building it, but you can't really finish it when you don't know what the end product's even supposed to be. This is the secret weapon that they're talking about. But in the midst of all of this, we also have an up-and-coming Orson Krennic, who we see in, trying to rise through the ranks, even though the seating arrangements inside this meeting he goes to on the regular doesn't really matter. He also kind of thinks it matters, and so he's trying to move around and earn closer and closer spots and figure out how he's gonna like make friends with the right people and that sort of thing. I like that he has a lot of strategy. Like, he's able to look at Masameda and like know what Masameda is gonna do based off of like if his tendrils are twitching or like what his fingers do. And so we're seeing that he has these secret weapons himself, that he has this ability to kind of read people. Krennic, in a lot of ways, is more about people and charisma and kind of using that sort of thing, and that's his strategy, versus like you'll see his rivalry with Tarkin. And Tarkin is more of not so much charisma, but like sheer force of will and power, and he's going to kind of make you do what he wants you to do. And he's got like that super battle tactician, where Krennic isn't really a tactician. He's not really a strategist in that sort of way, but he's really good at saying, this is what I want, and this is how I can make you feel good about giving me what I want. So there's a ruthlessness to him, but a different kind of ruthlessness. And I find him to be a really fascinating foil to Tarkin, because they are so similar in so many ways, and yet they are radically different. And that difference is really the difference between, Director Krennic and Grand Moff Tarkin. Just hearing about the construction of the Death Star is interesting to kind of lay up with where it would go with the Clone Wars, because they talk about how they're kind of consuming the droid factories on Geonosis. Of course, in Rebels, they go back to Geonosis. So just kind of seeing how this novel, along with the Tarkin novel, kind of play in with the two cartoons as well. And it really gives you this kind of larger feeling of all the Star Wars media kind of working together. The second part of this chapter is Krennic going to talk to Masameda. He decides to bring up his buddy, who just happens to be really good at energy crystals, and saying how he has this plan to get Galen in on building like crystals or doing research on crystals for energy for the Death Star. And that rescuing him would go a long way to kind of convincing him to do this, because Galen's a pacifist and never would do it on his own. Krennic really plays this part up, even to the point where he's talking about like kyber crystals, and he's like, if the Jedi wouldn't hang on to them so well, the Jedi kind of get Masameda all riled up, and I'm sure Krennic doesn't know why, but we know why, and he just plays that whole scene really well, and is like, I have this whole plan, we're gonna go to Zurpin, give Zurpin the resources they need to get Galen, but really we're going to get Galen, and then we're going to get Galen to come and work on this. He just can't know that we're working on a weapon. And Ameda is basically like, I don't want to know, you just do it. And so again, playing this idea of secret weapons, of Krennic's secret weapon is Galen, but then he also has a secret weapon so he can get Galen. And then in a way, Masameda sees Krennic as a potential secret weapon. And so I'm really liking these chapter titles, how they are about what they're about, right? Like, this is about the Death Star, but it's also about these characters who have these secret weapons. Oh, the other part that I liked was Krennic is discussing how he met Galen, and he said they met in the gifted program, and Amanda's like, you were in the gifted program? And, like, Krennic decides to just let that roll off his back. And I just thought that was kind of a funny chide that, like, because Krennic doesn't necessarily come off as that intellectually bright at times, he's like, oh, you were in the gifted program? I thought that was kind of a funny beat. And kind of funny how Krennic handles it. But that's what I have to say about this week. I hope you guys are enjoying the book so far. For next week, we're going to read chapters 4 and 5, and I'm going to kind of warn you, it's going to be more reading than we've done so far, because chapter 5 is kind of long. So be prepared. In the paperback, it's about 40 pages, which is a little bit more than I wanted to go through at a time, but that's just kind of the way it shook out. So read chapters 4 and 5 for next week. Let me know what you think so far. Leave a comment. Follow us on the socials if you haven't already. And I will talk to you guys next week.